The rifle scope showed a man who looked too much like Silas Crane to be coincidence. Same jawline. Same build. Same way of standing with weight shifted to the left leg, a habit Silas had picked up after taking shrapnel in Kandahar. The target was on a rooftop in Prague, 300 meters away, and he had no idea he was being watched. Silas adjusted for wind, his finger resting on the trigger with the patience of someone who'd done this 43 times before. Not 43 contracts. 43 versions of this specific contract. 43 men who all shared his face, his name, his DNA, scattered across timelines like broken mirrors reflecting a life he should have lived but didn't. The target turned, and even at this distance, Silas could see he was smiling. Talking to someone. A woman with dark hair appeared in the scope, and she was laughing at something the target had said. The way she touched his arm suggested intimacy. History. The kind of casual affection that comes from years of knowing someone's rhythms and deciding they're worth keeping. Silas fired. The suppressed round crossed the distance in less than a second, and the target dropped without ceremony. The woman screamed, and Silas was already packing his rifle, moving toward the stairwell exit with the efficiency of routine. He'd be out of Prague within 2 hours, on a flight to Vienna, and by tomorrow the contract would be logged as complete in the organization's database. Just another alternate timeline pruned. Just another version of himself erased from existence. Except this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the woman's scream, still echoing in his mind 3 hours later as he sat in the airport terminal waiting for his boarding call. Or maybe it was the fact that the target had been smiling right before he died, genuinely happy in a way Silas couldn't remember ever being. He pulled out his tablet and accessed the secure server where the organization kept its temporal records, files that technically didn't exist and couldn't be traced because they existed in quantum superposition until observed. Timeline 37. Subject, Silas Crane. Age, 34. Occupation, architect. Married to Sarah Voss for 6 years. No children. No criminal record. No connection to military or intelligence operations. He designed buildings that won awards, lived in a renovated loft in Old Town, and had season tickets to the Philharmonic. His biggest problem, according to the surveillance logs, was deciding whether to expand his firm or keep it small and manageable. Silas had killed him for being content. The boarding call came, and Silas stood, shouldering his bag, but he didn't move toward the gate. Instead, he found himself pulling up another file. Timeline 19. Another Silas Crane. This one had been a teacher, living in Boston, coaching high school debate teams. Silas had eliminated him 2 years ago with a car accident that looked mechanical, brake line failure, nothing suspicious. And before that, Timeline 8. A photographer in Seattle who'd never picked up a weapon in his life, who'd made a living capturing landscapes and weddings and moments that mattered to other people. 43 timelines. 43 versions of himself. And every single one of them had been living better lives than the one Silas was stuck with. He closed the tablet and walked past the gate, ignoring the final boarding call, heading instead for the airport bar where he ordered whiskey and tried to remember when he'd started doing this. Not the killing. That had started 11 years ago when the organization had recruited him out of the Marines, right after Kandahar, right after he'd done things that meant he could never go back to being the person he'd been before. But the specific killing. The hunting of himself across timelines. When had that become his primary assignment? The bartender was talking to him, something about whether he wanted another drink, and Silas realized he'd been sitting there for 40 minutes staring at his empty glass. He paid and left, catching a taxi to a hotel he hadn't booked, paying cash for a room where he could think without interruption. The organization called itself the Hourglass Foundation, though that was just one of dozens of shell names it used to move money and resources across international borders. Silas had been working for them for over a decade, but it had taken him 8 years to understand what they actually did. They didn't just eliminate threats to powerful people. They eliminated threats to timelines. Specific futures that certain parties wanted to prevent. A scientist who would cure cancer but collapse pharmaceutical profits. A politician who would pass regulations that hurt corporate interests. A journalist who would expose corruption that reached into 12 governments. The Foundation had access to temporal technology that shouldn't exist, stolen from a research facility in Geneva that had been officially shut down but had actually just gone underground, funded by money that moved through accounts in jurisdictions where questions weren't asked. They could identify individuals across multiple timelines, track their quantum signatures, and determine which versions of those people posed threats in which realities. And then they sent people like Silas to erase the problems before they became unsolvable. But somewhere along the way, Silas's contracts had become increasingly specific. Not politicians or activists or whistleblowers. Just him. Different versions of himself, living in timelines that had branched off from his own at various decision points. The Silas who'd turned down the military recruiter. The Silas who'd stayed in Baltimore and never left. The Silas who'd gone to therapy after Kandahar instead of letting the organization offer him a different kind of war. Silas opened his laptop and accessed the Foundation's deeper archives, the ones that required biometric authentication and quantum encryption keys. He'd been given access 3 years ago when he'd been promoted to the Temporal Enforcement Division, the kill teams that handled cross-timeline operations. The files were vast, decades of data, but Silas filtered them down to one search parameter, subject name, Silas Crane. 87 results. He stared at the number, feeling something cold settle into his chest. 87 timelines where a version of him existed. And according to the status column, 43 were marked as eliminated. The rest were flagged as active monitoring or pending action. Silas opened the oldest file, dated 9 years ago, and started reading. Timeline 62. Subject refused military enlistment. Pursued graduate degree in psychology. Established practice specializing in veteran trauma counseling. Flagged as potential interference risk due to advocacy for transparency in military mental health reporting. Recommended action, eliminate. Authorization, S. Crane. Status, complete. Authorization, S. Crane. Silas read it again, then checked another file. Timeline 41. Subject left military after Kandahar incident. Became advocate for rules of engagement reform. Published memoir detailing controversial operations. Flagged as reputational threat. Recommended action, eliminate. Authorization, S. Crane. Status, complete. Every file. Every timeline. Every version of himself that he'd killed had been authorized by himself. Not by some handler. Not by the Foundation's leadership. By him. He'd been signing his own execution orders for 9 years, systematically hunting and erasing every alternate version of his life that had turned out better than this one. Silas closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at Vienna's lights spreading below like a circuit board. He tried to remember the moment when he'd made the decision, when he'd chosen to become the architect of his own genocide, but the memory wouldn't come. It felt like something that had always been true, a fact so fundamental that questioning it seemed absurd. Of course he was eliminating the other versions. Of course he was the one authorizing the contracts. Who else would understand better than him which versions of Silas Crane deserved to exist? His phone buzzed. A message from the Foundation's Operations Center, text only, no sender ID. New contract uploaded. Timeline 5. High priority. Immediate action required. Silas opened the file on his phone, and the photograph showed a man who was definitely him but looked softer somehow, less worn. According to the briefing, Timeline 5 Silas had left the military after Kandahar and used his GI Bill to study social work. He ran a nonprofit in Detroit that helped veterans transition to civilian life, providing job training and mental health support and community. He'd testified before Congress twice about veterans' suicide rates. He'd saved an estimated 200 lives through intervention and advocacy. The recommended action was a home invasion gone wrong, street crime, nothing that would draw attention. Silas was supposed to make it look random, tragic, the kind of violence that happens in cities where systems have failed and desperation turns people into predators. The file included the target's address, his daily routine, the security system in his apartment that could be bypassed with basic tools. And at the bottom of the file, waiting for approval, authorization pending, S. Crane. Silas stared at the words for a long time. Then he approved the contract and booked a flight to Detroit. The apartment was in a neighborhood that had seen better decades, but there were signs of rehabilitation, community gardens and fresh paint on buildings that used to be abandoned. Silas watched the building for 3 days, learning the target's patterns, identifying the moments of vulnerability. Timeline 5. Silas came home every evening around 7, always stopping at a corner store to buy groceries, always nodding to the old man who sat outside the building playing chess against himself. On the 4th night, Silas entered the apartment while Timeline 5 was still at work. The security system was exactly as described in the briefing, easy to bypass if you knew what you were doing. Silas positioned himself in the living room where he'd have clear lines of sight to both the entrance and the kitchen. And then he waited, sitting in the dark, holding a weapon that felt heavier than it should. Timeline 5 came home at 7:12. Silas heard him coming up the stairs, heard the key in the lock, and when the door opened and the lights came on, the two versions of Silas Crane stood there looking at each other across a distance of maybe 15 feet. "I was wondering when you'd come," Timeline 5 said. He didn't sound afraid. He sounded tired. "You're from Timeline 1, aren't you? The one who's been doing this?" Silas kept his weapon trained on the man's chest. "You knew? We've been tracking you," Timeline 5 said. 27 of us, across different timelines. We figured out what you were doing about 3 years ago. Started comparing notes. Realized that every version of you that tried to build something better than what you have was ending up dead, and the authorization signatures were always yours." He set down his grocery bags slowly, hands visible. "Can I sit down? Or are you going to shoot me standing up?" "Sit," Silas said, and Timeline 5 moved to the couch, settling down with the careful movements of someone trying not to provoke. "Why?" Timeline 5 asked. "That's what I can't figure out. Why spend 9 years hunting versions of yourself? What did we do to you?" "You didn't do anything," Silas said. "That's the problem. You got to live. You got to make different choices. You got to be happy. And that's worth killing for?" "Yes." The word came out before Silas could think about it, and hearing it spoken aloud made something crystallize in his mind. "You don't understand what it's like, living with what I did in Kandahar. What I became. And then finding out that there are versions of me who made one different choice, turned left instead of right, said no instead of yes, and their entire lives are better because of it. They get to be good people. They get to help others. They get to look at themselves in mirrors without flinching. And I'm stuck being this." Timeline 5 leaned forward, and Silas tensed, but the man just rested his elbows on his knees, studying Silas with an expression that might have been pity or might have been something worse. "So instead of trying to be better, you decided to make sure none of us could be better either. If you can't have redemption, nobody gets it. Is that about right?" "It's not about redemption," Silas said. "It's about fairness. Why should you get to be the hero when we started from the same place? We had the same trauma, the same damage, and you somehow found a way through it while I'm still drowning. That's not fair. That's not right. Life isn't fair," Timeline 5 said. "But murdering everyone who proves that getting better is possible, that's not making things fair. That's just making sure everyone else drowns too." Silas felt his finger tightening on the trigger, felt the familiar weight of decision pressing down on him. This was the moment. This was always the moment, and it always ended the same way. Except Timeline 5 was still talking, his voice steady and calm, like he was counseling a veteran through a crisis and not sitting in front of a man who was about to kill him. "I know what happened in Kandahar," Timeline 5 said. "I lived through it too. Same mission. Same impossible choice between following orders and doing the right thing. And I made the same choice you did. The one that got people killed. The one that ended our military career and destroyed any chance we had of being proud of our service. But afterward, we split. You let the Foundation recruit you, turn your guilt into a weapon they could aim at other people. I went to therapy. Joined a support group. Learned that trauma doesn't have to be the end of your story if you're willing to do the work of healing. Healing, Silas repeated, and the word tasted like ash. You think you're healed? You think running a nonprofit makes up for what we did? No, Timeline 5 said. Nothing makes up for it. But I learned to live with it. I learned that the only way to honor the people we got killed was to spend the rest of my life helping people who came back from war carrying the same kind of damage. I turned my worst moment into a reason to be useful. You turned yours into a reason to be a killer. I was already a killer, Silas said. Kandahar just made it official. We were soldiers, Timeline 5 said. There's a difference. But you stopped seeing that difference when the Foundation told you that killing was the only thing you were good for. Silas stood up, and Timeline 5 tensed but didn't move. You're wrong, Silas said. I didn't stop seeing the difference. I stopped caring about it. Because caring means feeling, and feeling means remembering, and I'm tired of remembering. He raised the weapon, and Timeline 5 closed his eyes. Wait, Silas said, and he hated himself for saying it, hated the weakness in his own voice. The 27 versions who've been tracking me. What are they planning to do? Timeline 5 opened his eyes. They're planning to stop you. We've been gathering evidence about the Foundation, about what you've been doing, and we're going to release it. Expose everything. Make it impossible for you to keep killing versions of yourself because everyone will know. Every timeline will know. That won't stop me, Silas said. Maybe not, Timeline 5 said. But it'll stop the Foundation from authorizing the contracts. And without their resources, their technology, you're just one man. You can't hunt 87 timelines by yourself. Silas lowered the weapon slightly. Why are you telling me this? Why give me warning? Because I still think there's a chance you'll choose to stop, Timeline 5 said. I still think that somewhere under all the killing and the guilt and the rage, there's a version of you that wants to be better. That's tired of being the monster. And if I'm right, if that version exists even a little bit, then maybe you'll put down the gun and walk away. For a moment, Silas considered it. Considered leaving the apartment, disappearing, letting Timeline 5 live and letting the other versions expose the Foundation and maybe, possibly, finding a way to become something other than what he was. But then he thought about the other 43 timelines, the ones he'd already erased, and he realized that walking away now would mean admitting that all of those deaths had been for nothing. That he'd spent 9 years murdering better versions of himself for no reason except his own bitterness. He couldn't live with that. Couldn't accept that the only difference between him and the men he'd killed was that they'd been brave enough to choose healing while he'd been too afraid to try. Silas raised the weapon again and fired twice. Timeline 5 slumped back on the couch, eyes still open, that expression of tired pity frozen on his face. Silas stood there for a moment, looking at the body, and then he left the apartment, wiping down surfaces he'd touched, making sure nothing traced back to him. The Foundation logged the contract as complete. Timeline 5 was gone, and somewhere, in 27 other timelines, versions of Silas Crane were receiving the news and making plans. But they were too slow. Silas accessed the Foundation's databases and pulled up every file on every remaining version of himself. 44 timelines left. He started prioritizing them by threat level, planning routes, identifying the most efficient way to eliminate them all before they could organize a real resistance. And that's when he noticed something in the data that made him stop. Timeline 1, his own timeline, had a file. Subject, Silas Crane. Status, active monitoring. Flagged as potential interference risk due to psychological instability and knowledge of Foundation operations. Recommended action, under review. Someone had flagged him. Someone in the Foundation was watching him, analyzing him, deciding whether he was becoming more of a liability than an asset. Silas went deeper into the file, pulling up the psychological assessments and operational reviews. The reports painted a picture of someone who'd become obsessed, whose judgment was compromised, who was no longer capable of distinguishing between legitimate security threats and personal vendettas. The most recent evaluation, dated 2 weeks ago, included a recommendation: consider retirement protocols if behavior continues to deteriorate. Subject's fixation on alternate timeline versions represents mission drift and resource misallocation. Retirement protocols. That was Foundation terminology for assassination. They were considering killing him, the same way he'd been killing versions of himself. And whoever wrote the report had authorized it with their own signature, someone high enough in the Foundation's hierarchy to make that call. Silas read the name twice before it registered. The authorization signature was his own. Not from this timeline. From Timeline 0. The original branch, the first Silas Crane, the one who'd founded the Hourglass Foundation 60 years ago. According to the files, Timeline 0 Silas had discovered temporal technology in his early 20s and used it to build an organization that spanned decades and realities. He'd lived to be 93 before dying of natural causes, but his legacy was embedded in every operation the Foundation conducted. And apparently, one of his standing orders had been to monitor all alternate versions of himself and eliminate any that showed signs of threatening the Foundation's work. Silas was staring at his own death warrant, signed by himself, from a timeline that existed before he was born. He closed the laptop and sat in the Vienna hotel room, trying to process the implications. The Foundation wasn't just using him to kill alternate Silases. It had been designed, from the beginning, to make sure only certain versions of Silas Crane survived. Timeline 0 had decided which futures were acceptable and which needed to be erased, and every version of himself that Silas had killed had been part of that original design. He hadn't been making a choice. He'd been following programming laid down by a dead man who decided, 70 years ago, that the only Silas Crane worth preserving was the one who'd embrace being a weapon. And now that version, Timeline 1 Silas, was starting to break down, starting to question, starting to become the same kind of threat that he'd been eliminating. Which meant the Foundation would send someone to kill him. Probably another version of himself, from a timeline where he was still loyal, still useful, still willing to pull the trigger without hesitation. Silas thought about Timeline 5, bleeding out on his couch, asking why Silas couldn't just choose to be better. And he thought about the 27 remaining versions who were planning to expose everything. And he thought about the Silas from Timeline 0, dead for decades but still controlling their lives through the organization he'd built. Then Silas made a decision that surprised him. He deleted his own file from the Foundation's database. Not just the retirement recommendation, but everything. Every psychological assessment, every operational review, every piece of data that connected him to Timeline 1. It wouldn't stop them forever. They'd rebuild the file, notice the deletion, realize he'd gone rogue. But it would buy him time. Time to do what, exactly? Silas wasn't sure yet. But he knew that if he was going to die, if his own organization was going to retire him the same way he'd retired 43 other versions of himself, then he wanted it to mean something. He wanted his death to count for more than just being another name on a contract. He booked a flight to Detroit. Not to eliminate Timeline 5, he'd already done that, but to search the apartment, find whatever evidence the other versions had been gathering. If they were serious about exposing the Foundation, then there would be files, documents, proof of what had been happening across timelines. And if Silas was going to burn it all down, he needed to know what ammunition existed. Timeline 5's apartment had already been cleaned by local police, the body removed, the scene processed as a home invasion gone wrong. But Silas had access to Foundation resources, and he used them to get back inside, to search places the police wouldn't have thought to look. Hidden compartments. Encrypted drives. A safe built into the wall behind a bookshelf that required both a combination and a biometric scan. Silas didn't have Timeline 5's fingerprints, but he had his own, and apparently that was close enough. The safe opened, and inside was a hard drive, a stack of documents, and a handwritten note addressed to whoever found it first. The note said, "If you're reading this, I'm already dead. Probably killed by Timeline 1. I knew he was coming, and I chose to stay, to give him one more chance to walk away. He didn't take it. But that doesn't mean the work stops. Everything you need is on this drive. Share it. Spread it across every timeline you can reach. Make sure they can't erase this the way they've erased us. And if somehow, impossibly, it's timeline 1 reading this, if you killed me and then came back looking for answers, then here's the only one that matters. You're not the monster because of what happened in Kandahar. You're the monster because you chose to keep being one. Every day, for 9 years. That was always a choice. And you can still choose differently. It's not too late. It's never too late to stop. Silas read the note 3 times. Then he pocketed the hard drive and the documents and left the apartment, returning to Vienna, locking himself in the hotel room with a bottle of whiskey and the evidence that 43 men had died to protect. The files on the hard drive were comprehensive. Personnel records for every Foundation operative. Financial transactions showing which governments and corporations funded temporal operations. Technical specifications for the quantum signature tracking technology. And perhaps most damning, a complete list of every target the Foundation had eliminated across 60 years of operation. Not just alternate Silases, but thousands of people whose only crime was living futures that powerful interests wanted to prevent. Scientists. Activists. Artists. Teachers. Politicians who would have passed reforms. Journalists who would have exposed corruption. Children who would have grown up to challenge systems of control. The Foundation hadn't just been pruning timelines. It had been sculpting reality, deciding which futures were allowed to exist and which needed to be erased before they could threaten the status quo. And Silas had been part of it. Not just the part that killed alternate versions of himself. He'd eliminated hundreds of other targets over 11 years, never questioning whether they deserved to die, never wondering if maybe their crime was just being inconvenient to people who wanted to maintain power. He'd been a weapon. Not just for the Foundation, but for every structure that benefited from keeping things exactly as they were. Silas spent 3 days reading the files, cross-referencing names and dates, understanding the scope of what he'd been part of. And then he made copies. Dozens of them. Encrypted and stored in locations across 12 countries. He set up dead man switches that would release the information automatically if he failed to check in every 72 hours. And then he started reaching out to people who could do something with the information. Journalists who'd made careers out of exposing intelligence abuses. Hackers who believed in radical transparency. Government officials who'd been trying for years to understand why certain investigations always hit walls. He gave them everything. Not all at once, and not from traceable sources, but piece by piece, building a picture that would be impossible to ignore or discredit. And he waited for the Foundation to notice. They did, eventually. It took 2 weeks before Silas started seeing the signs. Surveillance that was just a little too obvious. Operatives who were trying to flush him out by making themselves visible. The Foundation wanted him to run, wanted him to lead them to wherever he was storing the information, so they could eliminate both Silas and the evidence at the same time. But Silas didn't run. He went to Baltimore. To the city where every version of himself had been born, where every timeline branched from the same starting point. He rented an apartment that overlooked the harbor, and he waited. The operative who came for him wasn't a version of himself. It was a woman named Kara, someone Silas had trained with years ago, before she'd been promoted to the Foundation's Temporal Enforcement Division. She knocked on his door at 3 in the morning, and when Silas opened it, she was holding a weapon but not pointing it at him yet. "Hey Silas," she said. "Been a while." "Kara." Silas stepped back, letting her enter, knowing that resistance would be pointless and probably fatal. "I figured they'd send you eventually." "You made a lot of people very nervous," Kara said, closing the door behind her. "Deleting your file. Stealing classified information. Distributing it to hostile actors. That's not the Silas Crane I trained with." "What happened?" "I figured out what we were really doing," Silas said. "And I decided I didn't want to do it anymore." "So you thought you'd burn down the Foundation and damn the consequences?" Kara sat on his couch, weapon still in her hand but casual, like they were just having a conversation. "You know what happens when you expose temporal operations to the public? Panic. Chaos. Governments trying to steal the technology. Timeline wars that make our current operations look like peacekeeping. You're not saving anyone, Silas. You're just breaking things because you're angry. Maybe, Silas said. But I'm angry for good reasons. And breaking things, sometimes that's necessary before you can build something better. Better for who? Kara asked. The Foundation maintains stability across multiple timelines. We prevent paradoxes. We make sure that reality doesn't collapse into quantum uncertainty. Yes, we eliminate threats, but the alternative is chaos that kills billions. The Foundation maintains control, Silas corrected. For people who benefit from keeping systems unchanged. And we eliminate anyone who might create a future where that control isn't absolute. Don't pretend this is about preventing chaos. It's about preventing change. Kara sighed, and for a moment she looked tired, older than her years. You always were too smart for your own good. Timeline Zero knew that. That's why he set up the protocols to monitor every version of you. He knew that eventually, one of you would figure out what we were really doing and try to stop it. And that's why you're here, Silas said. To make sure I don't succeed. I'm here, Kara said, to offer you a choice. Stand down. Stop distributing the information. Let us contain the damage. And in exchange, we'll let you live. Not in this timeline, obviously. You've burned that bridge. But we can relocate you to timeline 74. It's stable, monitored, and you'd have a life there. Not a great one, but better than dying in a Baltimore apartment at 3 a.m. And if I refuse? Kara raised the weapon. Then I complete my contract. And someone else deals with cleaning up whatever dominoes you've set up to fall after you're dead. Silas thought about Timeline 5, bleeding out on his couch, asking why Silas couldn't just choose to be better. He thought about the 43 other versions he'd killed, all of them living futures that proved healing was possible if you were willing to try. And he thought about the note, it's never too late to stop. I can't stand down, Silas said. Not because I think I'm going to win. But because if I do, then all of this, everything I've done, it all just continues. The Foundation keeps sculpting reality. Keeps erasing futures. And I'll have spent my last few weeks accomplishing nothing except dying with slightly less guilt. So you're choosing to die for nothing, Kara said. How noble. No, Silas said. I'm choosing to die for something. Maybe it won't work. Maybe the Foundation will contain everything, erase the evidence, keep operating like I never existed. But at least I'll know I tried. At least 43 better versions of me will be avenged, even if it's just symbolically. Kara studied him for a long moment. Then she stood up, weapon still trained on his chest. You know what the really sad thing is? Timeline Zero predicted this. He knew that eventually, one of his alternate selves would have a crisis of conscience. Would decide the Foundation was evil and try to destroy it. And he wrote protocols for exactly this scenario. Protocols that I'm following right now. So I'm predictable, Silas said. Story of my life. Not predictable, Kara said. Just human. And Timeline Zero understood human nature better than anyone. He knew that guilt and anger would eventually override training. That you'd reach a breaking point and make a dramatic gesture. He built the Foundation to survive exactly this kind of betrayal. She fired twice. Silas felt the impacts in his chest, felt his legs give out, felt himself falling. The pain was distant, almost theoretical, and he thought absurdly about Timeline 17 Silas, the one who'd lived to be 63 and died teaching his daughter how to change oil in her car. That seemed like a better way to go. More meaningful. Less pathetic than bleeding out on a floor in Baltimore because you tried to fix things too late and too clumsily. Kara stood over him, weapon lowered now, and she looked genuinely sad. For what it's worth, she said, I think you were trying to do the right thing. You just didn't understand that sometimes the right thing isn't possible. Sometimes all you can do is maintain the least bad version of reality. Silas tried to speak, but his lungs weren't cooperating. He could feel his consciousness starting to fade, the edges of his vision going dark. And in that darkness, he thought he could see them. The 43 versions of himself he'd killed. Standing there. Watching. Not forgiving him. But maybe, possibly, understanding that he'd tried, in the end, to be something other than their executioner. Kara left, and Silas was alone, dying in an apartment that smelled like old coffee and failure. His last thought, before everything went black, was a question he'd never get to answer. Had any of the information he'd distributed actually made it out, or had the Foundation contained it all, erased his final gesture the same way they'd erased 43 futures? He died not knowing. And maybe that was appropriate. Maybe that was exactly what he deserved. The information did make it out, eventually. Not immediately, and not completely, but pieces of it. Enough to start investigations in 7 countries. Enough to shut down 3 Foundation operations and force the organization to restructure. It wasn't the complete destruction Silas had hoped for, but it was damage. Real, lasting damage that took the Foundation years to recover from. And in Timeline 74, there was a Silas Crane who never joined the military, who became a librarian, who lived a quiet life helping people find books and never knew that in another timeline, a version of himself had spent 9 years killing everyone who'd made better choices than he had. That Silas was 42 years old, unmarried, content. He had a cat named Tolstoy and a garden where he grew tomatoes that never quite ripened properly, but he kept trying anyway. And maybe that was the real tragedy. Not that Timeline 1 Silas had become a monster. But that there were still versions of him out there, living good lives, having no idea that someone who shared their DNA had decided their existence was intolerable and needed to be erased. The Foundation continued operating. Reduced capacity, more careful, but still sculpting timelines according to the specifications that Timeline 0 had laid out 70 years earlier. And somewhere in their archives, there was a file on every remaining Silas Crane, flagged for monitoring, waiting for the moment when one of them would become inconvenient enough to require elimination. The cycle hadn't ended. It had just paused. And that pause had cost Timeline 1 Silas everything he had left, which admittedly wasn't much to begin with. So here's the question that should keep you up tonight. The one that doesn't have an easy answer. If you discovered that better versions of yourself existed in other timelines, living the life you should have lived if you'd made different choices, would you be able to let them exist? Would you be happy for them, or would you feel what Silas felt? That burning resentment that someone else got to be the person you could never become? And if you felt that resentment, if that bitterness started consuming you, would you have the strength to choose healing over destruction? Or would you do what Silas did, and spend years making sure that if you couldn't be happy, nobody who looked like you would be happy either? Think about that. Really think about it. Because the uncomfortable truth is that most of us, if we're honest, would understand exactly why Silas made the choices he made. And that understanding, that recognition of the same capacity for bitterness in ourselves, that's what makes this story more than just a cautionary tale about a man who became a monster. It's a mirror. And what you see in that mirror tells you something important about who you are when nobody's watching. So if this story made you think, if it made you uncomfortable in ways you can't quite articulate, then subscribe to this channel. Because there are more stories like this. More questions that don't have comfortable answers. More mirrors that show you things about yourself you might not want to see. And maybe, just maybe, confronting those things is how we avoid becoming the kind of people who'd spend 9 years erasing better versions of ourselves just to prove that getting better was never really an option. Or maybe it's already too late for that. Maybe we're all just one bad day away from becoming Silas Crane. Subscribe if you want to find out which one you are.